And now we come to the chapter known as groups of asanas. Now, in your textbook, there are 108 asanas. There's that auspicious number, once again, 108. There are obviously many more than 108 asanas known in the world of yoga. However, these asanas can be further subcategorized, not just when we're talking about supine, prone, sitting, and standing, if we're doing a Satyananda Hatha yoga class, for example, but also when you're specifically catering a class to a specific group of students. So, for example, say you're a nutritionist and you want to help your clients have healthier bowel movements, then you might want to include a lot of asanas for the abdomen and digestion. Or say you're teaching yoga to a bunch of people that work in an office and they tend to be very hunched and over their desk and typing away. Then you might want to encourage a lot of chest openers and back bends. So you can also subcategorize the asanas in a different way to help your students in a more complete way. So as we're looking further into these subcategories of different asana types, so for example, when you're doing a specific theme in your class, or you want to cater or help a specific group of students. So for example, asanas in Vajrasana, which is also known as thunderbolt pose, which is one of the weapons of Indra, also known as king of the gods. So Vajrasana can be quite uncomfortable a lot of the times. Sometimes sitting on your heels isn't that accessible to everyone, although this is a position that lots of cultures are very comfortable with. For example, some cultures don't even have a dining room table. They sit on the floor and eat like this. I know that for myself specifically, I always need to adjust myself in Vajrasana, so I like to use a bolster or a cushion or maybe some blocks. And already here with a little bit of height, I'm a little bit more comfortable, trying to make sure that your big toes are touching to keep that mudra with your feet. And for example, one of the asanas in Vajrasana could be Shashank Asana, also known as hare pose, when you keep your glutes down onto the ground and you lower yourself, trying to keep the back straight as much as possible and then come back up again. So again, there's various ways that you can look at the asanas in separate groups to try and help your students. Let's take a look at dynamic asanas. Now, lots of asanas can be with movement within the asana. For example, cat and cow, also known as Marjorie Asana. You inhale and open up the chest and exhale and round out the back. Or for example, Kati Chakrasana, when you inhale in the center and exhale on the twist. Lots of asanas can be dynamic. However, these dynamic asanas can also be performed in a static way. So if you were to perform Marjorie Asana or cat cow in a static way, you could open up your chest and breathe for 30 seconds, let's say, and then round out the back and continue to breathe for another 30 seconds. Or Kati Chakrasana. You can take a nice big inhale here, and in the twist, you hold it and continue to breathe. Please do not hold your breath. And for example, come back into center, nice big inhale, lead into the asana on an exhale, and tell your students to stay here for another 30 seconds. The same way that any static asana can be performed in a dynamic way. So if you take something, for example, like Warrior Two, where your feet are rooted down into the ground, your arms are in line with your shoulders, your drishti, your gaze, is above your extended forward arm, you're looking over that middle finger. Now, maybe you just hold it, because the asana would technically be considered a static asana. But maybe you'd like to do it in a dynamic way. Maybe your theme for your class is going to be letting go. And so you want your students to let go of some arrows. Maybe they have some thoughts that they want to get rid of. So while they're in Warrior Two with their legs, in Virabhadrasana 2, they could inhale and pull the arrow back, and on the exhale, release the arrow. So that would be a fun way to make a static asana dynamic. The same way, for example, in Utkatasana chair pose, you can have so many variations. You can come up on your tippy toes and down on your heels. You could come into a twist. Any asana can find its fun variation. So also you can keep your students a little bit more entertained and maybe surprised if they're used to the same practice over and over again. Now we're going to look at asanas in Padmasana, also known as lotus pose. Now this is what I would typically consider an ego pose, because it brings out the ego. The ego is that little voice inside that says, we're going to do this. And sometimes the ego is pushing to do things for the wrong reasons. Not always, but often. Okay, especially if you have students that have seen maybe a cool pose on a poster or on Instagram. I know that that definitely happens. I always receive students that say, I saw this on Instagram, I want to do that. And that's often what happens in Padmasana. You have to remind your students to continuously work within their limits because Padmasana can be quite uncomfortable. Not always, but if you're doing it for the wrong reasons, chances are you're going to end up injuring yourself. So let's take a little look at what Padmasana actually is. It is when your legs are making a pretzel shape, essentially. But what it really is a mudra for the feet. So if you take a look at how my legs are positioned right now, you can see that my right leg is bent and the energy or the prana from my right thigh is going down my right knee, into my right shin, through my right foot and down to my left leg, into my left knee, down my left shin, through my left foot and back into my right knee. So this is what we would call a pada mudra, a mudra for your feet, for example. I don't find it super comfortable. Remember that there is always an ardha variation. If a student isn't comfortable doing the full variation to something, they can always come into the ardha variation, which means half. So you could do half lotus pose or ardha padmasana, right? Something you need to keep into consideration is, would you teach an asana that you are not comfortable performing? The answer is yes. So if you don't enjoy an asana, and maybe you can't perform it because you don't enjoy it, or maybe because of your own physical limitations. I know that I definitely do not find it comfortable to meditate for myself in Padmasana. I do, however, offer it to my students because just because I don't like it doesn't mean that someone else might not like it, or in fact, might need it. Okay, so it's super important that you offer a whole wide variety of asanas, including the ones that you yourself aren't a huge fan of. I'll give you an example. When I teach my weekly class, I have some students that are circus performers. Now, these are people that can do amazing things with their bodies that I myself cannot do. I have some students that can do a handstand on just one hand, and they can even jump to the other hand. I cannot do that. I'm training really hard, but there's just some limits that we have. So when my students come to class, do I offer Padmasana to them? Yes, definitely. I find that it's an exciting way for them to even challenge their practice a little bit. Now, there's a difference between forcing and challenging because we always want to remain in sthira sukham asanam. So we always want to remain in that steady yet comfortable posture. That doesn't mean we don't want to encourage or push ourselves a little bit. Not in a bad way. Remember, keep the ego out of the practice. But for example, if I want to work on my flexibility and I want to work on Paschimottanasana, I might need a little encouragement. But if I push myself in the wrong way, so if I have to do Paschimottanasana, I have to get better leg flexibility, I have to do this, I'm probably going to injure myself because I'm going into it in a very violent and hasty way. So it's also thinking about how you're encouraging yourself. Remember that yoga is the journey. It's not the destination. It's what you're feeling coming in and out of the asana, not just performing the asana itself. So when it comes to pushing yourself or motivating yourself, make sure that you're doing it in a kind and loving way, the same way you would do with your students. You're never forcing an asana upon them. You're offering it as an option or perhaps a variation. So for example, with my students that are circus performers, when they are already in an inversion, I'll say, maybe you want to try and place your legs in Padmasana while you're in your one arm handstand. And so that they find a bit of a challenge, but it shouldn't be so challenging and so tough that you're getting frustrated and I can't do it. That's never going to be healthy. Remember, sthira sukham asanam, you always want to stay in that steady mind, comfortable body position. This definitely applies to Padmasana. Me, myself, I am not a fan of Padmasana. I do offer it. Some people find it comfortable. I might even offer it as a meditation posture if they're okay with it. If not, there's Ardha Padmasana, which is the half variation pose. And generally, it is a stronger way of coming into an asana. I can't think of too many asanas where it's absolutely obligatory to come into Padmasana. So just remember, be kind to yourself and guide your students safely. So when it comes to backward bending asanas, I want you to really think about not what it's like as a student when you perform the back bend, but what it's like when you're guiding as the teacher. So what happens when a student is in a back bend? Let's take Matsyasana, for example. A lot of things are being exposed. The chest is open, the throat is wide open, the belly is exposed, even the private parts are quite accessible upward facing. So let's take someone who's maybe had a hard day, maybe they're feeling emotional. You never know what the person in front of you has gone through. Maybe they've gone through a breakup, maybe they've lost their job, maybe they're just feeling sensitive. And perhaps when you guide an asana like Matsyasana, they begin to feel emotional. Well, that's normal. It's okay. It's important that you give your students encouragement and loving kindness, because it might feel very vulnerable to have your throat, your heart, your tummy, which is a very sensitive area for a lot of people. I definitely know that I don't like to overexpose my belly. As well, the pelvis, which is a very private region. Your sexual organs are there. So when exposing something so wide in a back bend, it's not just about what it looks like and how to keep your students safe in it. It's also about what it feels like. So this is when I encourage you to really take care of the words that you use. Make sure that you're making it okay for people to feel vulnerable if they do find themselves emotional, and make sure that you're offering variations. So for example, in Matsyasana, they could use a bolster or a block instead of lying on their arms. If they have neck issues, you would place their head on a cushion so that their neck isn't tilted all the way back and open, so that they're not feeling so exposed. Remember this union between body and mind. Yeah, it's not just about the physical performance of the asana, it's also about what the mind and what the emotions are feeling throughout it. So I personally believe that back bends are about the back, but a lot about the shoulders. Try and think of any back bend and notice where the shoulders are placed throughout that back bend. Pretty much all of prone is a back bend. So it's important to keep the core engaged, but especially it's important to warm up those shoulders because you don't want to have any injuries. Remember, wherever there is flexion, so wherever you're bending something, there's going to be extension as well. What does that mean? If I'm in a back bend, I'm bending my back, but I'm extending the whole front side of my body. So it's important to make sure that you warm your students up accordingly. I wouldn't just place my students, for example, in Chakrasana wheel pose. The very first thing that I do in a supine class, in a Satyananda class, in a supine category, I would make sure that I really warm them up first. And in fact, even if you're doing a Satyananda class and you want to stay authentic to supine, prone, sitting, standing, I almost would rather really warm with prep movements up, do a lot of Surya Namaskar, do a lot of other supine poses first, offer Chakrasana as a variation, as an option. Do the rest of your class, do your prone, do your sitting, do your standing, and then maybe before Shavasana, you might want to offer it again, just because it would be safer. So, oh, but we're going out of order. Satyananda will get so upset. The yoga police don't exist. I would almost rather going a little bit out of Satyananda order and performing the strongest asana at the end when I know that my students' bodies are well warmed up, rather than placing it right at the beginning and risking injuring my students. The same thing goes with forward folding asanas. So when you're forward folding, think of Padahastasana, think of Paschimottanasana. It's an act of protection. It's almost like you're cuddled into yourself. Also think of your vital organs. Your lungs, your heart aren't exposed like in a back bend. In fact, they're quite protected because your rib cage is hugging over them while you're kind of coming back into yourself or recoiling. So psychologically, it could be a nice comforting asana to perform, especially if you notice that your student is playing some mind movies, if they're feeling specifically vulnerable. It might be nice and calming for them to have a little introspective moment and come into a forward fold. Now, the thing with forward folds that I always like to say is think with your heart and not with your head. When you think with your head, you think automatically that you want to touch your toes. So let's take Paschimottanasana as an example. In Paschimottanasana, you might think, I want to touch my toes. So you might be rounding out your back a whole lot. But really here, I've lost the whole stretch in my legs. So I'm not going to get very far by the ego that wants to touch my toes. In fact, what might be even better is imagine that a string is pulling you up from the crown of your head up to the sky. Inhale and find that extension in your vertebrae. And on the exhale, keep your back as straight as possible. As soon as you notice that you're recoiling, then that's where you need to stay. So as soon as you notice that your back is getting round, that's when you bring your hands down. I would much rather see someone in this type of Paschimottanasana than in this type of Paschimottanasana, because here there's not that whole many benefits. Whereas here, although it doesn't look as pretty as a nice deep Paschimottanasana, you'll have a lot more benefits here, and it'll just be a lot safer for the student as well. Don't forget to encourage your student to use props. So there's no shame in using props. A lot of students feel intimidated that by using props, they're weaker or they're not as capable of performing the asana. On the contrary, props are there to help assist even the most advanced yogi find a juicier version of the asana. Go back to the image of the spinal column, of the blocks and the socks in between each block, which is the vertebrae. You never want to forward fold by squashing the vertebrae and the discs in between. You always want to find extension before flexion. The same thing is going to happen in a twisting asana. First of all, you want to think of how you're guiding the breathing, because as we've seen before, your lungs have their own axis. So when they twist, they're not twisting together. One lung is going to twist a little bit more than the other lung. And then in the other direction, one lung is going to twist a little bit more than the other. So you want to take that into consideration, because that's a compression of the lungs, so that when you're guiding the twist is always going to happen on an exhale. Now let's think about when you twist. Now we can just simply twist, for example, without doing anything. I can twist and I can see how far I can go and how far I can reach. However, let's go back to that image of the blocks and the socks, as the vertebrae. We always want to find extension before we twist. So for example, instead of just twisting to see how far I can go, let's inhale, find extension in the spinal column, and then perform the twist. I'm sure you can see even on camera that just through that nice deep breath I just took, I was able to twist so much further. Give it a go, give it a little try and see if you can twist further when you inhale before the twist. I'll show you again. On my right side, without breathing, this is as far as I can reach, this is as far as I can go, and now I'm going to extend. Already, I can notice that my torso is so much more revolved just by giving my spinal column that juicy space in order to really create the twist. Because if you want to think about your spinal column like a wet towel, when you wring that wet towel, that water is going to drip out. So energetically as well, twists are really good for letting go of that blocked liquid in your spinal cord, so cerebrospinal fluid or perhaps blood. And when I say blocked, I'm not saying that there's no movement at all, but someone that sits at their desk all day, perhaps with a hunch or poor posture, isn't going to have a whole lot of juices flowing in a nice way. They might be a little bit slow. It might just not be flowing so freely. So a twist is a great way to get even energy. Say you're really stuck in your head, you keep going over the same thought over and over. Chances are that when you come into a twist, especially through that exhale, you're able really to release and let go. Standing asanas. I think standing asanas are underrated because standing asanas can really help posture. I understand if you have some students who perhaps spend all day on their feet, and so when they come to an asana practice, they just want to do some lovely seated or reclined asanas, perhaps some prone, and they want to get off of their feet. However, I think that you'll notice that especially people that find it hard to sit straight in a meditation, people that are often hunched over, or for people that sit at their desk a lot, standing asanas are really going to help clean that posture up because you're using your core muscles. Now, core doesn't always mean abs. Engaging your core means using all of the muscles, activating all of the muscles that are going to help keep your spinal column upwards. So whether you're in a warrior one, whether you are in trikonasana, you're engaging your legs, you're helping that rooted, grounded feeling come up through the ground, really helping your especially your joints, your ankles and your knees get stronger and really aligning the spinal column. So I believe that there's only positives with standing asanas. Now, balancing asanas can be both really fun and really frustrating because balance isn't always easy. It's perfectly normal for you to come out of balance, whether you're balancing on your hands or whether you're balancing on your feet. Sometimes you don't even have to be in a balancing position to lose your balance. So it's completely normal that a student gets frustrated when practicing a balancing asana. As the teacher, it's super important that you're always very encouraging and that you help guide their mind in a positive way. So for example, what's the first thing that you think about when you fall out of a balancing asana? You might have said a bad word right there. I definitely know that I am like, shoot, I fell out of that asana. That's so annoying. I'm actually a little bit meaner to myself. I might say something a little bit harsher, but you get what I'm explaining. So it's super important that when that happens to your students, that you remind them to be really kind. It's okay if you've fallen out of the asana. Try and notice what language you're using to speak with yourself. Encourage them to try again. Remind them that balance is going to be different every day according to how you're feeling, according to maybe you have an ear infection. I know that I have a student that has labyrinthitis, which is an imbalance in the liquid in her ears. And so sometimes even walking or even 2 feet on the ground asana can be frustrating for her because she tips over and loses her balance. So it's really important to be encouraging and tell your student that they can try again. Another beautiful thing about a balancing asana, not just the fun part, is that it's great for the mind. In fact, they say that every asana program should include a forward fold, a backward bend, and a twist. And in my case, I always try and include as well a balancing pose. Why? Because balancing asanas help focus the mind. So if you're an overthinker like me, I love to overthink things. I love to make a big deal about little things, and I tend to be a little dramatic. At least I'm conscious and aware of it. I love a balancing asana because it won't let me get into that dramatic headspace about things. When you're in a balancing asana, you're not thinking about your to-do list. You're not thinking about, oh, I should have said this to that person in that argument. You're not regretting things. When you're in a balancing asana, let's take kakasana, for example, you're not thinking about all of the emails you need to reply to. You're thinking, I better not fall flat on my face. So balancing asanas are also great for helping you focus and helping control the mind. So I definitely would recommend balancing asanas in a class to help keep things playful in a light-hearted way. Inverted asanas. This is the group of asanas that tend to scare people the most because let's face it, going upside down is really scary. So the first thing that I need you to do as the teacher is to be super understanding and compassionate with your students. Whether you're comfortable going upside down, and if you are, try and remember the very first time that you went upside down. Were you a little scared? And whether you're not comfortable going upside down, then you'll definitely be able to relate. But as I've said in the previous groups of asanas, you should be able to provide asanas even though you yourself do not perform them. So this has nothing to do with your own physical abilities as a teacher. It doesn't mean that you're a bad teacher if you don't like to be in a headstand. You can still teach a headstand. In fact, it's even safer for you to really be there and protect and be loving with your students, especially because you understand where they're coming from. So I definitely would say that compassion and understanding is a vital thing to have when you're guiding an inverted asana. There are definitely a lot of questions that are going to arise. For example, what if I'm menstruating? Is it safe to invert? I always make sure that I tell my students that we are going to be inverting before I explain or before I guide the inversion, just so that you're giving them a little bit of warning and that they can also decide whether they actually want to invert. Please remember that inversions aren't always headstands or handstands or pincha mayurasana, forearm stands. An inversion can also be sarvangasana, shoulder stand. It could also be viparita karani. It could also be just bringing your legs up, anything that's going to allow the flow of blood to flow in the opposite direction. So definitely making sure that you're warning your students that you will be guiding an inversion before you actually guide the inversion. But with regards to menstruation, Sonia is going to cover yoga for menstruation in another chapter of this course. And for any other types of injuries, make sure that your student is responsible for themselves. That means that if they have high blood pressure, they are not going to be inverting. Remember, there's always a variation for them to do. Make sure that your student isn't just sat watching everybody else do an inversion because they're not supposed to. Give them something else to try, something maybe challenging that's a safer option for them. Maybe they just want to do bridge pose, a gentler version of a back bend, which could be not a full inversion, but at least they're getting a little bit of a stretch in. But generally, if your student has a big condition, they need to bring a note from the doctor that states that they are safe to do a yoga practice, including an inversion. If there's any doubt, avoid it. It's always best to keep your students safe. However, don't shy away from teaching something that could be seen as a little bit challenging. Remember, It takes time and practice to feel comfortable doing these things. So the more you practice teaching it, the more confident you'll feel. But if you never practice it, you're never going to gain that confidence. Another thing to remember when teaching inversions is to really make sure that your students are warm enough. Chances are they'll be doing a lot on their shoulders or even a lot with their neck or with their arms. So for example, in Sarvagasana, shoulder stand, it's super important to remind your students not to move their head or neck in that position. Whenever you place your student in an asana, always think to yourself, why have I placed my student in this asana? What is it that you want them to feel? So it's nice to work backwards in the sense of, where's the biggest point of injury in this asana? What do I really need to warm up so that they feel safe and comfortable doing it? Inverted asanas have a wide variety of benefits other than concentration and especially for the circulatory system, but also it's a great ego boost because inverted asanas can be challenging and can be scary. It can also be beautifully motivating and encouraging for your student to perform an inversion. I know that for myself, when I do an inversion, afterwards I feel really proud of myself and really satisfied that I did something that I might have been scared of doing, but it also feels really good. Also, don't forget about all of the space that you're creating in the body. The vertebrae are going upside down. All of the organs are going upside down. So things that are normally squashed are having a different space, a different point of view, let's say. So inversions, there's plenty of benefits. Don't shy away from teaching them.